Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar. My name is Tim Cusick. I am the WKO4 TrainingPeaks product leader. I'll be taking you through the show tonight. I'm just it's so funny. As soon as I decide to launch, I see people joining, so I'm letting a couple of people join. The names I see, most of you have been on the webinars, which is great. I'm going to take you through today building FTP, TTE, and Stamina. So we're going to learn a couple of new things tonight. We're going to put out a couple of secrets and show you guys something that's coming down the pipe. They're actually going to start testing in the Facebook group next week. So I will show you some unique stuff. I will share it in the Facebook group, but we ask just until we finish our validation with you guys as a team. You kind of keep what you're seeing here a little bit quiet. All right, jumping right into today's presentation. It looks like we got our group. As most of you know, there's a little question box. I already see people typing, good morning. So I assume that means you can both hear me and see me, or at least see my screen, so that sounds great. If you need to ask questions, as most of you know who have been on my webinars, you can ask questions as you go. Just simply open the little control box with this little orange arrow and type your question down here. It shows up on my screen number 2. I answer questions as I go. Probably 3 or 4 out of 5 questions I actually just blend into the presentation, so I don't necessarily stop and say, here's the answer to your question. So feel free to put them as we go. I personally don't like coming back like 20 minutes later or 30 minutes later and asking a question that you probably even forgot you asked. As just like in the last webinar, which you haven't launched last week's webinar, it is recorded and can be shared on the playlist or accessed on the playlist on the Facebook group. These last 2 webinars have been really about opinion. So it's very important. A lot of people have asked us, a lot of our previous webinars were about metrics and usage and stuff like that, where people wanted us to get a little more into how do I use, maybe some case studies, things like that. So the challenge of that is I need everybody to understand that this is an opinion. Hopefully most of my opinions are based in scientific fact, but they're also based on experience and wisdom of working with top-level athletes and, and coaching. So there's a little bit of both. I'll gladly take questions, but I'm not a deep debater on certain things. I really don't want to get caught up in the tit-for-tat of it at times, which has never happened to me on the Facebook group or here, so it's great. Everybody's very respectful and understands. 2, I respect everybody else has their own opinion. That's kind of part of all this learning. One of the roles of WKO4 giving us all this unique tracking and metric development is you can go out and validate, look, determine, and understand what works for you. So feel free to put in your questions as we go. No, I'm talking about opinion. You can question opinion. I'll certainly bring it up and out loud, and we'll can discuss a little bit. But I also don't want to go too deep. That is a final point. In some of these, I present some overarching kind of ideas, and I'll say it, it's really hard in a webinar unless you want to be on for 4 hours to go deep into stuff. So you tend to be a generalist. So just be careful of, correcting down to a more precise level than what I'm presenting. One of the key principles that I employ in my coaching, I always show it here because when we start talking about metrics, it always comes up in metrics, is this idea of cost benefit. I went over this in the last webinar. I'm just going to do this one slide. If you didn't see the last webinar, definitely watch the first 10 minutes. You'll get a deeper insight into this idea. The reality is anytime you start tracking, training, developing, implementing a new strategy, every coach really should be going through a cost-benefit analysis of what they implement. So every idea, every new workout, everything you do has a cost. We always want to make sure the benefit outweighs. When you first start, the cost seems low and the benefit seems high. It's like, hey, I got an idea, and you go and you implement it. It seems like it's working. It seems like it's starting out well. But there's always this point of intersection where the cost begins to potentially outpace the benefit. It's really important that we look at our ideas and make sure that the things we're implementing are happening within this range. This really is a balanced cost-benefit approach. The thing when you're talking about cost benefits, right, and why it's important when we start talking about metrics is cost benefit is usually a versus style analysis. So if you focus on FTP, you might give up Pmax. If you focus on FTP, you might give up FRC. Or if you focus on FRC, you might give up FTP. Stamina versus sprint, power versus fatigue resistance. The response to training, we wish that we could do one thing and everything would get more fit everything would improve. But as we all know, the reality is, specific dose or training intensity tends to elicit specific response. So the reality is metrics give us the ability to begin to track that. So what is the role of training metrics? Why did we introduce all these training metrics? A lot of people originally focused on the fact that we introduced a power duration model and that you could begin to look at a modeled FTP. But the reality is, when we looked at what a coach or a self-coach athlete is trying to accomplish, at the core of everything we build is the simple performance statement. When you look at success in coaching and training, you're talking about the ability of the rider and the demand of the event. So we wanted to develop this idea, this software that derives metrics that helps coaches better understand the ability of the rider and then better understand the demand of the event, and then understand the dose and effect of our training strategies and how it affects those. So it's diagnostic, it's prescriptive, it takes us through a lot of functions. So what training metrics and do we use to begin to quantify this? Well, we've introduced PMAX, which you generally will all know. We've introduced functional reserve capacity, or FRC, which is basically a scoring of your anaerobic work capacity. We are introducing today TTE, which is time to exhaustion. We've already introduced functional threshold power, or MFTP, when we're talking about, and then we've introduced stamina. So when we have these metrics, what role do they play? I grabbed this slide from a previous presentation that actually showed eye levels. You see here this power duration curve, and you see a strange MMP behind it jumping around and having plateaus and numbers. Most people think that all the effort we put into was really in developing a curve so that you could see your modeled or your estimated FTP. The reality is we put a tremendous amount of effort developing in a curve that could output metrics that aligned with certain physiological areas, zones, certain physiological, or actually better yet, aligned with the physiology of the athlete. So if you think about these sections, we're measuring neuromuscular power. On the curve allows us to develop PMAX, which is a more accurate output of neuromuscular power. It allows us to measure your anaerobic work capacity, or W, throughout the FRC ranges, which is an accurate representation of how much work you can, continuous work you can do over threshold, and all different ways that can play. And we're actually measuring your threshold. We've also given you two related to your physiology metrics. One we recently introduced, which is stamina, your ability to sustain steady efforts over longer time. I'll get into the actual definition here. And the new one, time to exhaustion, which I'm going to get into. So suddenly you have 5 metrics at this point where you could begin to understand this diverse response to training. If I do X, what happens to the athlete? If I prescribe X. If I prescribe X plus Y, what happens to the athlete? We're giving you the metrics to track it, and we're introducing some art and understanding, but the reality is, it was great. Andy and myself and a couple of other people had this discussion the other day. The metric is just showing you what's happening. It is a gauge of each one of these physiological areas that highly impact endurance performance. You have to begin to build more and more what is the relationship. As we build towards norms and other stuff, we express them, but the reality is it's really allowing you to individualize the relationship between dose and response in exercise or exercise prescription. Why do we quantify these metrics? What does it help us do? Well, it helps us build performance strategies. So event type selection, what type of selection you should be in. Race strategies, how can you race? What's your overarching strategy? And race tactics, how do I win? How do I take a green jersey? How do I score points? Whatever it is that you're doing. It also gives us training strategy support, sort of like I was just explaining, training load, training content. We've always had training load, right? PMC, there's probably rarely ever been a better tool invented than the PMC. And its ability to give us insight into training load is fantastic. The new metrics give us much better understanding into training content, training targets, and training dose and response tracking. Tonight we're going to do TTE, functional threshold power and stamina. The last week's one we did PMAX and functional reserve. It is up on the playlist. You can watch it at your leisure. Now I'm not going to do these in order for a specific reason, so I'm actually going to do building functional threshold power first. All right, let's start with the modeled functional threshold power. What is it? MFTP is the model-derived highest power a rider can maintain in a quasi-steady state without fatiguing. So I know that some of the people on this list probably have seen this pretty spirited debate about this. So let me tell you what FTP isn't. Now you have to kind of go back to the original days and know that Andy posted, Dr. Andy Coggan, who's kind of the inventor of the idea, posted what he called the 7 deadly sins. And they're all different ways of estimating FTP. Estimating your FTP is not bad. I mean, in the absence of some better mechanism, it's a great estimate, it's a great way to go about it. But the reality is, as the arguments and the discussions of threshold and MFTP get more precise, you have to draw the line and just make sure people understand that each of these are estimates. The first one is most controversial in certain ways. FTP isn't your highest power for 1 hour. Actually, I should say it isn't necessarily your highest power for 1 hour. And actually, I'm going to show you a lot on that tonight and give you some insight to go deeper there. It isn't necessarily your normalized power for a hard 1 hour. Both of these tend to relate, but there's some people that this won't work for. This will work for the bell curve of people, 50% probably, but the other 50% this doesn't work for a reason we're going to discuss. This will work for a bell curve of people, probably same maybe 50%, not the same people, but probably 50% of the audience, but the other 50% it doesn't work for. One of the things that I've personally learned is there's a lot more normalized power busters out there in the world than we thought. And then 95% of 20-minute maximal power test works for about 50 to 60% of the people, and it's not quite as accurate as we think. The reality is the 95% is an estimate of degradation, of decline. And that's based off the average person in population. You might be 93 and somebody else might be 97. We need some better ways to determine these items when we start thinking about FTP. Why do I want FTP? Well, in an overarching term, FTP is the single biggest determinant of racing success. And you know, Andy's preached this for a long time, and I certainly am a believer. It doesn't mean it's the only one, so be careful what that's telling you. But it is the single biggest determinant, meaning if I had just one thing I had to build in an athlete, I would build their threshold. And generally in a road race, TT'er, I mean, don't get me wrong, if you're doing the 500 on the track, I might not care all that much, but I think you get the point. 2, it's the foundation for determining training levels. Now with eye levels, that's changed a lot, right? But it hasn't completely gone away. It's just become more individualized. It still is the anchor point of a significant amount of training levels. And finally, it's a physiological tracker of a type of fitness gain and loss. Am I improving? Am I getting fitter? Or am I losing fitness or performance, depending on how you look at that. The reality is, when we say the term threshold, when we say the term functional threshold power, the nomenclature, the way it gets broken down is most people associate that with the word threshold. So what is threshold, right? We see all these complex thinking and stuff like that. Let's start with the basic idea of what threshold is. It really is simply a commonly used, the term is commonly used to describe the point where exercise intensity, when the energy source of your body uses to fuel your activity, changes significantly and measurably. So there's a significant and measurable change. Threshold. But the challenge becomes, right, in threshold, there's different thresholds, and you ask people and you get an array of kind of complex to simple answers. Now I'm going to confess right here, I was checking this just before the meeting, my animation got all wacky, so this might not work. But I'm going to try to give everybody a quick little overview. So step one, when you start talking about threshold, right, here's a very simple definition. Well, first we've got to make it more complex. So the cap of all threshold is your VO2 max, which is simply the maximum amount of oxygen the body can use during a specific period of unusually intense exercise. There's probably 42 versions of that definition out there, which read generally the same, so just take it as a simple definition. It is the cap, it is the maximal ability of what you can do in this range. So the reality though, then you actually do have a maximal lactate steady state / lactate threshold 2. And these, and I'm lumping these together for the sense, they typically are tracked very similar and are the same thing, but I'm making sure I'm trying to simplify a little bit what's already about to be complex. This is the highest exercise intensity at which the production of lactate and its clearance are balanced. We also have AT and LT1. And AT, LT1 is the point in exercise where lactate levels first start to raise above baseline. So I didn't mean these as an exact gap. As a matter of fact, I left the gap big enough to write these words. But the reality is your LT1 happens slightly before your LT2. And there's a relationship, which I'm going to discuss here shortly, but you technically have, if you get into the real complex level, 2 thresholds. Then you add to the fact you also have what's known as OBLA, or onset blood lactate. So the reality is OBLA is the exercise intensity when lactate starts to continuously accumulate in the blood. So you have all these different things which could be threshold, LT1, LT2, OBLA. Now VO2 max is not your threshold, it is the cap of them all. But the reality is this is complex. So let's take a look at this, and here's where my animation is going to go wrong. The reality is OBLA and MLSS, L2, they're really the same too. So if you want to start simplifying it, let's just combine those. You're really not talking about anything separately here. So instead of dealing with 3, let's deal with 2, and let's just combine those. Well, once we combine those and we look at the combination of the 2, here's where my animation, let me just put them all back on there on the screen for you. So if we combine OBLA and MLSS/LT2, we get a whole lot of letters and acronyms. So the reality is if you take the exercise and intensity when lactate starts to continuously accumulate in the blood and add to it the highest exercise intensity at which the production of lactate and its clearance are balanced. Well, if you take those 2 definitions and you functionalize them, this is, I think, what the genius of what Andy did, right? He took a series of complex things and said, people just want to ride their bike. And they don't want to go to a lab all that much, and they don't want to take blood and breathe through a scuba apparatus and things like that. They just want a real simple way of determining it. So he looked at these thresholds, OBLA and MLSS and LT2 and LT1. If you functionalize exactly that description, pretty much what you get is the highest power a rider can maintain in a quasi-steady state without fatiguing. That roughly means that FTP reasonably coordinates with OBLA, MLSS, and LT2. So for me, and I know there's some hot debates on this in places, I eliminate the idea of using lactate threshold 2 and MLSS and OBLA, and I just use FTP, because the reality is it's a simple, easily testable, easily trackable piece of data that any athlete can wrap their hands around and avoids complexity. So again, my animation's messed up. Let me just feed it in. So the next point is this. The reality of MLSS and LT2 and LT1 is they typically track together as metabolic fitness increases and decreases. It's pretty rare that they don't actually move in conjunction based with exercise. So the reality there too is you're maintaining 2 different thresholds for little to no benefit. Don't get me wrong, at some point and some high level of specificity it could matter, but for 98–99% of us it doesn't. As your metabolic fitness increases, both LT1 and LT2 will go up basically in the same rate. As it decreases, they'll go down basically is the same rate. So again, in the continued goal of simplifying this idea, we just kind of take FTP. So VO2 max is still the cap. all these other items basically get rolled into the ideas of this. I specifically focus on two: VO2 max and the use of VO2 max, and in doing a lot of percentages. And I know Andy's starting to roll out some super secret charts in the Facebook group, which is really cool stuff, and some things we're going to be working on in the next 3 to 4 weeks. But you're going to see more of us taking a deeper dive and a deeper look at VO2 max. So I guess that's going to be another webinar down the road. So I'm just tracking those two. And here's why, guys. One, it's simpler, right? There is a very user-friendly relationship with FTP. And as a coach, part of your job is communication. Part of your job is motivation. Part of your job is education. I would much rather implement training strategies based on a simple to understand construct that I can look at, compare to a power I'm putting out on the road every single day, versus something that might be, a 0.5% more accurate, but yet more complex, harder to understand, above the head of my athlete, and doesn't help them understand their on-the-road activity. So to me, that's a main driver. One of the things that we've been talking about a lot about in these webinars is, and I'm going to come back to this, so how do you build FTP? Well, to me, FTP is something that it really is a periodized progression. I'm going to tell you a little story here in a moment about FTP. And I put some specific points in here, which I'll go in depth later, so don't overly focus on them. Let's stay on the hours. I like to put it in a periodized progression. If an athlete comes to me, or I'm highly focused on FTP, or just I believe FTP is something they really need, I progress it in a periodized fashion. I do believe in periodization, but there's lots of types of periodization, reverse periodization, linear periodization. Here I really mean periodizing the progression. I think FTP is a developable physiological performance, that a point in performance actually, that probably most benefits from a good, steady, progressive format, because of it's very efficient to do it that way, because of the relationship of how FTP operates under your VO2 max and how fitness and other factors can be gained. So I tend to have a generally progressive format, a recipe of progression. Now this might live within an annual periodized plan, but so I'm talking about something different. I'm just making that point. But I do progress through. I tend to start with an FTP and aerobic foundation and extensive aerobic training, which evolves and progresses into intensive aerobic training, which evolves to a phase that I'm choosing my words carefully here, that has an extensive to intensive anaerobic training. There's a role for anaerobic training in the development of FTP, particularly when we start looking at the relationship of VO2 max. And then finally for me, I have an intensive FTP speed work. At the end of the day, you always have to translate it to speed, but I'll go into that in a moment. So why is my FTP ranging from aerobic work all the way through intensive anaerobic training? Well, let me tell you a little story. I think this is one of the better ways to explain it. I've seen people probably do it better than me, but I've used it for a long time with athletes, and unfortunately I'm going to use it on you. So you start thinking about your fitness house, right? And when you start out, this is your little house. You have this aerobic ranch house, right? You have a one-story house with a nice little ceiling. The VO2 max is the ceiling to kind of your little aerobic ranch house here, right? So let's put our little baby FTP. Here he or she is, and she's born into our house. Little baby FTP has a ceiling, right? This blue line is baby FTP's FTP. Well, the reality is you get into training, or you get off the couch and start training, or you're doing something specific, right? You need to build upon that, and you want to start growing your baby FTP. So little FTP starts to grow up. What is it? Start with the basis of aerobic training. I mean, the reality is that is the foundation of a good threshold. It is at the basis of it. There is no true escaping it. I know there's high-intensity approaches and 80-20, polarized, all those other systems that do have some effect. I will tell you right now, and I'll take the controversial stand, I do not believe that they are the best way to approach training. That doesn't mean they can't be effective. I think they're high risk, medium reward. The problem with polarized and 80-20, every experience I've seen with it, it's a little too much of a crapshoot. The trick of periodized planning is really more about progression. Progression is the way to best increase the odds for success. And to me, I'm someone who works that way. So our little baby starts out, they have plenty of room to go, right? They're in their house, they're growing, they start taking on a diet of aerobic training. What happens? Well, they do a little training and they get bigger. And they get bigger in their house and their FTP is growing, but it's getting close to that ceiling, right? So the reality is fitness, metabolic fitness, often, particularly starting from the untrained, is you're simply able to raise thresholds closer and closer to that VO2 max ceiling. Then let's say you get to this point and you keep doing aerobic training, right? You keep doing what you're doing. Here's what happens. So I'm sorry, my little FTP growth spurt. Let's say we keep doing what we're doing. We really can't grow all that much more in our house. You know, we're pushing, and we just don't have the room. So what you need to do here is if this diet is too much continued focus on aerobic, FTP is generally out of room to grow, and we need a bigger house. So what do? Well, we need to raise that VO2 max ceiling a little bit, change the dimensions of our house, make it taller, so that with some increased training, we could improve. Now we move our diet to extensive to intensive anaerobic work. That pulls up the ceiling. That's what you want to do at this phase of FTP building. Once you've really maximized how big you can get it, how much you've pushed it up from below, and you're starting to bump that VO2 max ceiling, you know, you've closed the gap till it's pretty tight. You wouldn't expect much more improvement. You can spend some time raising that ceiling. But then the reality is too, you need to go back to do some training that will utilize that raised ceiling or utilize actually the room to grow, right? And push that back up. And with the ceiling raised, FTP has a little more room to go, and that's my phase 4. If you notice, maybe I should even put them on there. The 4 phases as I was showing you is phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, which I'm going to get into those in detail here in a minute. So understand how we grow. What I bump against just as teaching coaching is a lot of people either get stuck here or try to go right to here. And that, to me, this is one of the problems of HIT training and 80-20 and polarized. It can be, you know, maybe you raise the ceiling, but I don't think you grow as tall in that house as you can. So how much can you actually improve those? Well, I stole this from one of Andy's presentations about annual training. I've showed it a couple times before because I think it's an excellent summary. Right off the bat, if you look at lactate threshold improvement, which remember we're using FTP, magnitude of short-term training, you can improve it 30 to 45%. Magnitude of additional with long-term training, months to years, an additional 20 to 30%. Now that's a pretty big range, and the reality is you're looking at coming off the couch, untrained athletes, you know, all mixed in there. But the reality is building your FTP also has some of the biggest growth range potential of any other area that you can build. You know, I showed this slide in the last presentation. When you look how much you can improve your anaerobic capacity or neuromuscular power, even efficiency, all this mythical efficiency, nothing trumps improvement ranges that you can take in lactate threshold. Then part of that is driven by, you know, there's this myth, and it's not a myth, it's a scientific reality, but people twist it in too many ways. Basically, you know, VO2 max is genetic. That is a reality. You know, if you have a really high VO2 max and people say, man, you must have worked hard to get that, we all know all you needed was the right parents. So, you know, we got you. We know what you did. But the reality is that doesn't mean it can't be improved. There's a couple of different strategies for improving VO2 max and your ability to utilize VO2 max that will leave room for improvement. Once you've kind of gotten that improvement and are training at that level, there's no more to be had. That certainly is a reality. But most of us aren't training in a way that's maximizing or getting our VO2 maximal usage, correctly using all that. So the reality is there is more room to grow in there. So you go back to my house exercise and you think, gee, you know, I can grow in the house, raise the roof, grow some more. So that's an interesting way to think about FTP, and that's why I progress it through a series of changes, because the physiological cost, right, of raising threshold to doing aerobic and threshold, you know, intensive aerobic work is lower. So I want to spend more time doing that until I maximize the results. Then when I'm as big in my house as I can be, all right, I'm going to do a little anaerobic work. I'm going to do above threshold stuff to raise the roof. But the reality is that's more fatiguing. The physiological cost is a little higher. So I want to maximize this, get the most I can out of this, do a quick push of this, then actually I return to this in my system. So I normally would show some workouts, but I'm going to actually go through time to exhaustion next and then show the workouts together. I don't have as in-depth the workouts because I'm going to talk more about ideas here. So this is all new and super secret. So except for the 60 some odd people on here, it's a total secret. It's not. Actually, it's funny. I bet you it's something you've noticed and just we haven't quantified it, nor have you. So one of the metrics that our next update, which won't be out till mid-July in WKO4, I would actually expect the third week of July, will be, you will see time to exhaustion up on the hero bar with the other metrics. The hero bar is where you see your CTL, ATL, and Pmax and all those things up there. We're going to add TTE, which is time to exhaustion. So what is time to exhaustion? And it's like, man, I know I'm going to have to put on my flame retardant suit and the wattage list is going to go nuts. But the reality is time to exhaustion is a measurement of the maximum duration for which a power equal to FTP can be maintained. I'm going to say that again. Everybody read it. Time to exhaustion is the maximum duration for which a power equal to FTP can be maintained. So before I go deeper, I want to be really careful that no one gets this definition wrong. It's as opposed to the maximum duration FTP can be maintained. It's such a subtle difference, you're probably looking at it saying, huh? I don't get the difference. So I'm going to get into it, I'm going to show you some things, and I'm going to come back to this definition. Because the reality is we're so convinced that threshold is 1 hour. If you looked at the different threshold, LT1, LT2, and look at all the research, basically in any research you look up, it'll say you can be held for 30 to 70 minutes, depending on the research and what's the range. It's true with FTP. Now, there was a mistake when it first rolled out. We did over-connect it to a 1 hour test. And then that became the norm because we didn't have smarter ways to express it. We didn't have software that could show us unique stuff, and we couldn't get deeper into the dialogue. That became the norm, and now we're working very heavy to correct that norm. And it ain't easy because it's very locked in. And you get some strange responses when you tell people it's not an hour, you know. But the reality is it's not necessarily an hour, and we're about to start learning what it could be. Remember, we're testing this, and the Facebook group will be the test, so we're going to be gathering feedback and stuff like that. To be honest with you guys, we have 2 formulas, which are slightly different. The difference is a couple of percentage points, but we've chosen one to test, and we might end up going back to the other. So I got a great question. It's a statement. TTE, isn't that where the PD curve and one's MFTP intersect? Dave, yes. Almost exactly what you said, so I'll get to it. So my point is, yeah, you're already looking at it to some degree. So here's the expression for time to exhaustion. You can take a screenshot. I'll put them in the Facebook group tomorrow if you want. No big deal. We're not hiding it from the Facebook group. So if you use TTE, mean max power, this returns a time response. It'll be time, minutes and seconds. Hours, minutes, and seconds potentially, but minutes and seconds in general. For the time range selected, if you did TTE mean max power at 90, it would return time for 90 days. Now you could change that 90 to 120, 20, 30. You guys know that everybody here, I bet you, knows how to do that. So those are your 2 core expressions. Okay, I'm going to show you a chart where everybody's going to, there's more questions in the next chart than answers. So let's take a look at this expression and what it looks like. So the red line is power duration curve. and the orange line is threshold. And as Dave just astutely pointed out, there's an intersection point. You see a point of deflection happening here. Nice rolling kind of smooth line. It is a point of deflection. The purple line is your TTE. It's not in the, in future build it will be in the hero bar up here. And you can see over here, and that's probably a bad color, this person's TTE is 35 minutes and 38 seconds. And the reality is, and this could just be how they're riding and training. As a matter of fact, particularly I know this is just a data set. I don't necessarily maintain it. Excuse me. So the data set, you see that TTE, excuse me, got a frog in my throat and I didn't bring water down with me. So you see that TTE being at really around 39 or 36 minutes. Well, you can clearly see it as the drop-off point. As Dave said, you can see the intersection. But now there's a double secret going on in this chart. There's a blue line. So this is your watts by FRC being contributed to your threshold. Excuse me again. The green line is your FTP watts being contributed to your threshold. This is totally new. Nobody here has seen this. You'll see this rolling out in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So if I picked a point here, I don't know why I picked, I picked here at 20 minutes. You just can't see the line. It didn't work. All right, I see. I must have took, sometimes I take the screen capture. It messes up the hover over line. So I'll show you. Super secret. Remember, you're all sworn to secrecy. So the reality is, and pardon me 1 second while I take a drink so I can actually express this. Much better. So the reality is, if you look at what I'm showing here on the screen, right, it's important to note these two if you can really understand time to exhaustion. So the FRC, see the wattage contribution, what watts are contributing from your anaerobic system and what watts are contributing from your aerobic system. So if I was to look at this athlete at 20 minutes, they are getting, the PD curve is representing 274 watts, of which 260 are being generated anaerobically, and they're getting a small contribution, actually an okay contribution, from their anaerobic ability. We tend to think that we produce energy at threshold purely aerobically. We don't. We're always producing energy both anaerobically and aerobically. And the reality is you get a contribution from each. Depending on your physiology, fast twitch muscle, anaerobic capability, blah, 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 you can actually get, have different blends, and depending on your training mode, better understand the contribution of both your aerobic and anaerobic system. Now, the reason it's important to be talked about here is look at what's happening with your aerobic contribution. For this athlete, really, at about 3 minutes, we see that flat line, that aerobic follow line, but you see right there, that's a point of deflection. So I'll tell you too, just as the other TT, is it really the point, exact starting point of the point deflection, or is there some slight degrade? There's a debate on that, right? So it might actually, you can see the two lines. Right now we're testing it right at the point of deflection, but the reality is we might want to let it drop to a certain amount below to truly be a measurement of exhaustion. So you guys are seeing something totally new. If anybody's really interested, if you're interested in experimenting with this, email me at tim@WKO4. I'll send you the chart. Just don't let it totally public out, please. So that's what time to exhaustion, let me set this up and swap it again, is representing. Yeah, I've gotten at least 5 or 6 comments about NP busters. Yeah, if you're an NP buster, you're probably over the course. I'm an NP buster. I'm the NP buster that was a thorn in Andy's side for a couple of years. So the reality is the only way I can ride a decent TT, a 40K TT, is I have to have a certain amount of anaerobic fitness too. My contribution, I need to get those extra watts out of that system. If you're an NP buster, or maybe the way you produce, you're not producing all of that energy aerobically. Both systems are contributing. That's going to change a lot of discussion, because right off the bat when people see TTE, they're going to say, no, it's an hour and it's but the reality is you're going to see point of deflection. It's going to be hard to argue with. Again, the question Andy and myself and Kevin, and there's some pretty smart people in this meeting, I'm going to be picking their brains after this fact, is TTE really just after? But you're really probably talking about the swing of 2 minutes. At what point are you truly exhausting? The point you start to exhaust, or the point you've demonstrated exhaustion? So that's what TTE is. It's an output of time. I should have thought of a better color if you can't see it, but it's an output of time. And it simply tells you when you can no longer sustain a power equal to your FTP. Now the reality is, somebody asked, and this is a person with a pretty short TTE, that doesn't mean that, if you think about it, the declining average isn't as impactful as what came before it. If I had, just think about average, right? If I had 40 minutes of a TT on this side and, I don't know, some 10, 20 minutes on this side, or 30 minutes of I'm trying to complete a 40-kilometer time trial, obviously what's happening here is significantly more weighted in the average you see there. It's just a matter of points, number sum, and what a true average is. But TTE tells us when we begin to decline. Any questions on that? So, to me, why TTE is so important is, and you guys probably, if you've been on this meeting, you've heard me preach this, right? One of the things that I have been disappointed in with the introduction of power training is there's been this amazing focus on more power is more power. More is more. And we start out power training and we kind of think more. More results in significant problems. Look, don't get me wrong, you want it, but you want it in a controlled sense, right? So I see everybody driving for more power, and the results in high power approach to every interval is every workout seems to be this higher power approach. What I see as a result of that, which I think is hurting coaching, and particularly the development of younger riders and people coming in or trying to get to the pro ranks levels, is we look at shorter total time, and maybe here I mean time in zone, I'm going to give you an example here in a minute, and lower quality workouts. So to me, one of the things that I've been testing TTE for a long time. I actually showed it once in one of the early webinars and no one picked it up. The reality is, for me, when I'm looking at this theory, an idea of TTE, I believe that probably more than half of, if not more, 60, 70%, I'm making that statistic up, so don't quote me later, of athletes, because of the 2 times 20 rule, that's what I call it. We've so introduced this 2 times 20, two things go wrong. The athletes always do 2 times 20, and always the progression is a little more power. I want more power. I want more power. So you believe you're progressing if you do 2 times 20 at 240 watts, and then later you can do it at 250 watts. And then you'll be the same person, same hypothetical person, who comes back and says to me, my threshold cannot be that low. I'm doing these 2 times 20s all the time at 290 watts. But if you just look at this point, it actually was happening on Facebook posts, and I've been hesitating to answer it till this presentation, but I'm going to jump on it tomorrow. If you look at TTE, or this point of deflection, sure. So you've gotten really good at training yourself over 40 minutes, and you have a degradation, a decline after that, which does negatively impact your overall FTP. The second thing is that I see all the time in this focus as we go, we want that higher FTP number. So if I can do 2 times 20 at 290, that means my FTP must be 280. So you set your FTP at 280. And then you're like, now I'm going to do 2 times 20 SST, which you target at, I got to do some quick math, 255, whatever the number would be, 260. And you do the first one, and you're really struggling, right? You're right on the edge. And the second one, yeah, you crack, you drop off. You only do like 248, 245. you're really hurting the quality of your workouts by overstating the FTP by the desire to just have it be a higher number. So here's a bit of wisdom for everybody. And from this point forward, when people ask me this question, I'm going to answer it this way on Facebook. If you want to use 20 minutes as an indicator of your fitness, just use maximum 20 minutes and say, this is what I can do for 20 minutes. Think about it. Why, if it's the only thing you always test, do you have to then take it times 95% to be threshold? If you're doing it and you're doing a lot of 20-minute intervals, say that's my maximum 20-minute power and base intervals off of that. Yes, 95% tends to be a reasonable estimate of FTP, but not always. And you're now learning why. Because you might not be able to just sustain power equal to FTP as long as you think you are. So that could be a game changer in the perception. So when you're out there drilling it for 20 minutes to prove that you're stronger in 20 minutes so that later you can raise your threshold number just to feel good, you're probably hurting your overall performance in endurance sport because two things are happening. Your intervals based off that, focused on trying to get more power, are too high power and too low duration. Not always, some general. I mean, you need to mix in high power, low duration, which I'm about to explain. And then two, you're probably doing some pretty crappy intervals. I see it time and time again. I say, oh, post that 2 times 20 workout you did. And you see the second one being dropped off. 10 watts, 8 watts. I prescribe my athletes to be progressive all the time. Your second 20 minute is a little stronger than your first one. Your third 20 minutes a little stronger than your second one. Maybe the same. Maybe 1 to 2% decline, depending on what their level they're really targeting. But the reality is not declining throughout. If they can't hold the prescribed, whether you're using eye levels or classic levels or threshold or CP targets, if they can't prescribe what you're holding, it's based off an incorrect number. Go back and look at your athletes and look at the number of time that happens. You're going to say, that guy in the webinar, he was kind of making sense. Trust me, it's out there more than you would think. And my question box just lighted up. So I'm trying to get to them all in this description, but if I don't get to you, I will. So here's one good question that sums them up. Dave, another good question. Does the intersection of FRC and FTP contribution curves say anything actionable about the rider's fitness capability? So Dave is looking at this point. Yes and no, Dave. It does give some insight into how they're making power. And it could be, that means, it could be the result of training. It's obviously based in some of the natural genetic capability. Now, if you start doing, like I was showing last week, the muscle fiber analysis, and you might learn more about that athlete. But changes in this intersection point based on a training prescription, that might be interesting to track. Right now, this intersection in the same point, right? At the end of the day, it's a metric. Remember, a metric is a way to quantify performance. We quantify performance to better understand the dose and response relationship of exercise. I bet you there's not a person on this webinar saying, gee, I really want to move that to the right. Yep, that would be good. And the reality is, how do I move it to the right becomes the question. You'd probably get the same question in here. All right, so more power. Why TTE? I preach this all the time. You need to blend a thinking of fatigue resistance to power equal to FTP or power at any level. We get so focused on more power, that's all we do. Sometimes you're raising power, sometimes you need to be thinking about fatigue resistance. Fatigue resistance is more often the way you're going to win a race versus more. Give me an athlete who's more fatigue resistance versus one who has 5 more watts at threshold or 50 more watts in the sprint. I'll take the more fatigue resistant athlete every time because they'll perform better. It's the discussion of moving the needle to the right versus up, even though we know there's a relationship. Extending the curve. Think about what I'm talking about, extending the curve. You're just extending this out. And I'm going to comment on this, this is why I'm putting all the workouts sort of towards the end, affects MFTP and stamina. There's a very high correlation between FTP and stamina. So your ability to push out TTE will actually have positive effects on your stamina. What does this mean? Well, just take a standard curve. We love to believe fitness is we just do some working out, and all our fitness is fitness improved. It all got better under the same type of curve. I've preached this in webinar after webinar. The reality is there's two ways you can move a curve. This shape is sigmoidal. You push on one area, it tends to improve, but the reality is another area tends to go down. It rarely ever moves in a very clean little overarching, like the red to green example here. Two ways you can move the curve. Technically, you can push to move the curve up. Moving the curve up in an intensive format also moves the curve to the right. If you think about, the line, this point of connection, moving it up would also move the point of connection to the right. So one of the ways you can grow it is this intensive, and that's what I'm talking about, more and more power. There is a role for it, don't get me wrong. And when you're going to do more power at different training durations or zones or levels or whatever you're coming with, if you're going to be intensive, be intensive. And of course the other result is extensive. If you're doing extensive work, you're working on your fatigue resistance, your ability to sustain effort for sustain power for a longer period of time. So if you've noticed through all my webinars, I preach this combination because it should be a point of thinking. It's a process. It's a thought. So when you're looking at workouts, just try asking yourself: am I doing this intensively, trying to push it up, or extensively trying to push it out? Because the reality is you get caught in between a lot. You try to get the best of both worlds. My learning is 80% of the time, 90% of the time, the best of both worlds really means the worst of both worlds. And Jordan, I see your question. I'm coming back to it. It's a very good question. So be thinking about that. So let's talk a little bit about workouts. You guys, I don't have a lot of workouts for you here. As you can see, I'm talking overall theory, hopefully some that's opening some eyebrows and making you think. The funniest thing is I also have my Mac on the left-hand side, and I've gotten 5 emails from people on the webinar right now. So I haven't had time to read your emails, but I actually have a pretty good guess what you're saying. So great, you're engaging. I appreciate the feedback. That's what WKO4 is here to do, give you metrics to help you think. Question everything, look at it with a quantifiable number. Okay, so remember my little chart, I should have put it in here. I don't want to zip all the way back in the name of time, but I broke it into phases. So looking at some phases, my FTP aerobic foundation, my phase 1, I said base miles, tempo, long tempo. So 2 of the workouts I put in here, and first of all, don't overthink it. It's pretty much what you see there, right? So it's really hard when you're like, hey Tim, what's the super secret workout in base miles, tempo, and long tempo? Okay, in base miles, I don't do junk and I don't do long, slow miles. I like to focus on a certain amount of steady. Doesn't mean I have to kill it, anything else. Base miles, I keep pretty simple. I want people to be progressive. To me, progressive means I hate when people go out at, let's say the zone is 200 to 100, and the training level 2 is 200 watts to 170 watts. I'm just making that up. And they go out at 199.5 and hold that for like an hour, and then they're tired, and then they drop down to 185, and then the third hour is 170, and then they kind of come home, yeah, I'm over target, but at 165. Base miles, I get my athletes to reverse that. Go out at 165 and go to 170, go to 175. You don't have to kill it, but don't finish softer than you started. That doesn't mean you're finishing at 800 watts. It could be a subtle increase. It's just something good to put in your brain. It helps you fight fatigue, and it breaks the habit of going out too hard and finishing too soft. Tempo, long tempo, I am, again, remember, I don't believe polarized is, not that I haven't prescribed it. The whole idea of polarized 80-20 isn't my cup of tea. I've used it, tested it, done it in certain ways, and it can work. Again, to me, it's just the risks are a tad too high. I'd rather stay my kind of steady state. A tempo exercise I use is called the grind. A simple warm-up, 30 minutes of level 2, and based on time, there could be 15, 10, 5, none. And then in this sample, I'm using a 45-minute tempo divided into 3 cadence sections. Low cadence first, so first 15 minutes, 65 to 75, mid cadence, 75 to 90, and then the last at high cadence at 90 plus. 2 reasons I do this. in my tempo work, and if it was 60 minutes, it'd be 20, 20, 20. If it was an hour and a half, it'd be 30, 30, 30. And the reason I do this is, one, is some people might say to do it the other way, but in a slower rate, you're working a different type of force early. You're engaging and ensuring that you're engaging a lower, slower twitch fiber early in the effort. As you move forward and you're learning to spin faster and faster, one, it's creating more aerobic demand. So you're even if you maintained your power perfectly steady, you will actually demand more out of your aerobic system. So it creates slightly higher aerobic stress and strain. And then two, psychologically, it trains people to spin when they're tired. It helps overcome that mental barrier and spin when they're tired. My next one is long tempo. So here's what I'm going to show you how I use TTE. So long tempo. I personally believe athletes with time, who have the time to implement these type of strategies, don't do enough long tempo. If you're going to adapt a kind of steady state, classic periodization, level 3 SST based training, longer tempo plays an excellent role within that. And here's where you can use time to exhaustion to set targets. So you might just do a long steady state. Now a steady state tempo, remember that word, I'm going to show you something here, or that group of words, I'm going to show you. Target at a percentage goal, so say 85%, pick 82%, pick 87%, but in the range. Go longer and longer. So over time, you're extending this. So I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But use your TTE as a target. So start out targeting 150% of TTE. So I find that most people in tempo zone can start out and do about 150% of their TTE. That's a number that I've established as a norm. Find your own for the athlete, whatever works for you, but I find it works pretty good. And then for most recreational cyclists, I want to get them to 200%. Of their TTE. I have a pro who can ride 400% of their TTE. Don't get me wrong, it can be extended. I'm just giving you guys a general target. Go learn for yourself and find out. The key point when I said here a 45-minute tempo, and I said here keep going longer, remember, be progressive. If you're 45 minutes today, do 50 minutes the next day, the next workout, not the next day, you get the point. And extend that to 55. Extend that, because what you're doing is you're extending TTE at the same time, right? Potentially, you got to track it, make sure it's being effective, but you're extending fatigue resistance and you're progressing the workout. So you're using progression to ensure that you're overreaching, and in such overreaching, you're pushing the curve to the right, because we're not necessarily saying here, go out and do a whole bunch more power. We're just saying do the power you're doing for longer. Same reality here, right? I might always use the 85% target. I just might use 150%. And then as TTE gets longer, it naturally gets longer. And then I might up 150 to 160, then 170, 180. Good way to use TTE. In phase 2, I moved to intensive aerobic. I should have put that chart. That would have been a good idea. I showed it in every other presentation. Andy and I created that new chart of what extensive and intensive is. I'll show it at the end. So here's something new. And this is something that's funny that Andy and I actually, he had the name. He was laughing at me in a presentation. So intensive aerobic training, a tan tempo ride, right? So we say tempo, and I get this question a decent amount. I'm surprised I don't get it more because we get so ingrained into just doing the way things the way everybody else seems to do them. So is tempo, you want a very low VI? Is that a pure steady state? Is all tempo steady state? Well, what about normalized power? Well, if I ride it pretty calm, the VI is low and they're pretty close. But is there a benefit for doing some tempo at sort of a mixed pace? And the answer is yes. So a tan ride is what Andy named, it's called tough as nails. It was a workout he used to do when he was younger, and it's something that he just heard me talking about in one of the webinars and was laughing because he did them and I did them. And we finally decided to name it tan. And this is really a mixed pace tempo. And in the mixed pace tempo, you're mimicking like you're in a break, not a crit. You're not drilling, going back corner, going back corner, going back corner, but you're mimicking like a break. So you're doing some surges, maybe trying to, you know, flick a couple of people out of the break. You're having a VI, which can be kind of like a 1-1, you know, you're putting a little mix into it. Again, don't get too crazy. I'm not saying, you know, go out there and drop a 1.5 VI and get nuts, but you can mix it up a little with some attacks, some surges, some pushes, some up and down. Same idea. 85% might be your target, but now you're using normalized power as your goal. I should have put that in here, so take that note. Normalized power is your goal. But do it till you can sustain, as long as you can sustain it till you have a 5%, so you drop to 85%, and a continual drop, not just, you know, I couldn't hold it down that little hill, or I'm tired, I can't hold it for a minute. You should be able to sustain more than 150% of TTE. Remember, I've told you I've already experimented enough to know that's a reasonable baseline starting. So just keep doing it. My example, I do it. I just have about, I don't know, 3 miles from my house, there is a metric century course, which is really a good one because it doesn't have, you know, it's not confusing. It's got good climbs, but nothing brutal. It's pretty steady. You know, it's got a lot of rollers in it. And it's like, I just go out and ride it at a good high tempo. And as I get fit, I go deeper and deeper and deeper into the workout. I just sustain that threshold for longer. And it's like, yeah, this isn't a breakthrough workout. Maybe not anything I'd prescribe to a pro who has all kinds of unlimited work time and other things. But the reality is, for a lot of us training in recreational, it is the way we race, particularly category racers and other stuff. It is a specificity of what you're preparing for. So it is not a bad workout. TTE, SST. So the reality is just doing SST work, right? But start with this idea of TTE. Take about 110 to 125% of your TTE, make that your targeted total time and zone, and break it into 2 or 3. Either spell it or use the number, Tim. Break it into 2 or 3 intervals, make your target, and go. So there's another great example where you can take a classic workout, you know, SST, and break the habit of more by understanding your TTE and actually extending the time beyond TTE. And I definitely get a prize for the number of times I've said TTE in this webinar. So you get the point. Simple as that. And 110, 125, you know, that's again a good working range because, you know, obviously as you're doing that work, your TTE is also moving, hopefully. So it's getting longer. So a good kind of target that might help make some improvements in there. I also will do some FTP work in here. So for me, I typically will target, and I should have put a better explanation here. I'm targeting about 105% of TTE time, but I'm doing the FTP intervals in short, more intensive. So 10 to 15 minutes of FTP at like 103 to 107. I usually say 105, but it's hard to be that precise. Right at that edge, right at that upper edge of your FTP FRC zone. But again, I bet you a lot of people are doing that, so I'm not teaching you anything new except the idea of using maybe TTE. And then TTZ, by the way, means time training zone. The next phase is extensive to intensive anaerobic training. So when I start this phase, I start with extensive training. I showed this last time. I don't change these type of workouts. I use them in conjunction with FTP building because I need to, at some point, you've maximized all the aerobic gain you're going to get, right? So now we got to make the ceiling a little higher. FTP, FRC edge intervals. I showed you this last time. 2 sets of 5 times FRC, FTP edge with a limited recovery. So extensive R, I'm doing more with a limited recovery, 1.5 to 2 to 1 type of range of the intervals. So if the interval's 2 minutes, I'm resting for 3 to 4 minutes. Little cool down. Then I do this first, maybe a microcycle or 2 or 3 microcycles of this, and then I move into a more intensive version. Remember, it's extensive to intensive anaerobic training. So here I'm doing 6 times short FRC PMC edge intervals. So if you don't know what edge intervals are, go back and watch last month's webinar, and you'll see me describe them much more in depth. I'm just not now in time. But I will give you this FRC idea. This is the slide from one of the slides I was using. An edge interval is an interval you're using power and time as the edge. So if you were doing a FRC FTP interval, this athlete, that's right, this is a slightly strange athlete, so not a great example. You would do it on the edge of, let's say for 1 minute, you could target 1 minute at 619 watts. That would be the upper edge of the FRC FTP interval work. Now, I wouldn't target exactly 619 for the 1 minute. Go back and watch that webinar and you'll see what I would do. But I'm using that relationship, the eye level, as the general targeting strategy. It's a great response. Tried the FRC edge intervals last night and it nearly killed me. Yeah, once you go intensive, it is intensive. That is definitely where you want to kind of die on the handlebar. Remember, back it off. You're not targeting that full 619. You're not targeting the full power at the edge, but make sure you're doing it. But those are go hard. What does Andy call them? Go hard, puke, go home. It's the best way to do it. Finally, and just a couple of notes here, is once I'm in that final stage, I'm building speed. So to me, just because I got this question like 4 or 5 times after the last one, do I ever do motor pacing or speed work? Yeah. If you're going to race, in the end of the day, you got to take everything you've built and translate it into power. So to me, I think motor pacing, and please don't go out and crash behind a motorcycle tomorrow or scooter or a car and say, Tim from TrainingPeaks said I should motor pace. Motor pacing is inherently dangerous. You need someone who you need 2 people who know what they're doing. One on the scooter, one on the bike. Everybody's got to know what they're doing or it can be really dangerous. But motor pacing is a way to get much faster. It really is. In other absence of motor pacing and stuff like that, training races is, and it's, notice when I said motor pacing gets you faster, I didn't necessarily say stronger, even though there's a relationship, but faster. And training races actually can help a lot. A lot of times we don't use training races to really develop speed, and that's another option. For me, most of my intensive FTP speed, once I've made the house taller, right, the last little pickup is caught in high speed work, motor pacing, over intervals, things like that I would be doing. All right, I'm going to add some discussion on, so those are a bunch of workouts that build FTP and TTE. You can see why they were related. So let's talk a little bit about stamina, because stamina got a little neglected here. Stamina is a measure of the resistance to fatigue during prolonged duration, moderate intensity exercise. Units are percent of maximum, so 0 to 100%, although most individuals fall in the 85 to 95% range. And basically, if you think of your curve moving out, to the right, to the far right, it gets pretty flat, right? So the percentage basically is the percentage of decline. It really is just kind of simply trying to put a number to that percentage. Why do I want stamina? Well, the ability to reduce decline in power output over extended durations. Extended durations. So all those people are asking me the relationship of stamina and FTP questions. You're about to get your answers here. So ability to reduce decline in power over extended durations. 2, the ability to stay on power duration curve for over extended durations. You got to be aware though, building stamina, if you just build it the way your mind originally tells you, what you think is going to be true, the cost can be pretty high. Because right off the bat, right, somebody thinks, well, if I want to build stamina, I need 8-hour rides. Not true. Not false either, but not true. If you just go the ride long to build stamina approach, the cost to riding long is pretty high. Again, I like a periodized level, SST, FTP, tempo-driven training strategy over polarized 80-20. But one of the things that those systems really can teach us is this: going too long can actually have some negative effects, that the fatigue cost can be pretty high. So what are we talking about? We're talking about stamina. We're talking about what's happening out here. And stamina is the ability to take this declining line and extend it out here and reduce that decline. That's all you're really talking about in a visual sense. So we talk about stamina building, right? I don't have a bunch of workouts. This is my last slide. Part of this is we're experimenting with it. nobody's really tracked this relationship of fatigue well in the past. So we're not sure what the norms are. And this is part of, we figured out a way to track it, but we're not 100% sure what it's telling us yet. What we are learning very, very quickly, which is what we expected to learn, is there's a high correlation with FTP. Now we're trying to figure out the time correlation, but the reality is raising FTP seems to be one of the best ways to improve your stamina, i.e. slow the decline of your duration curve at time ranges out past an hour, extended time ranges beyond that. So the reality is we are seeing a correlation between FTP building strategies and that extension of stamina. It's something that's on the list to be studied with the 20 other things deeper, but there's certainly, Andy predicted it right off the bat, to the point where he almost said we shouldn't measure stamina separately, to give him credit where credit was due, that we should just think about some expression or some visual way of extending FTP, because the relationship will be very similar. So basically what that would mean is if your FTP goes up 5%, your stamina is more than likely to go up 4%. There's a high correlation. 6%, 2%, I don't know. Test it. That doesn't always mean always, and again, that's the power here. It's individualized. But there is still seems to be a pretty strong relationship. So at this stage, recommending doing FTP building in a way that extends your TTE. So I don't have a lot of specific workouts for you, because at the core of it is, I wouldn't say at the core of it, part of it is take a threshold-based training focus. Would I do quite the amount of intensive threshold and other stuff if I was a stamina person? No, I would probably really more focus on the extensive side. I might not ever, if I needed stamina, let's take a classic approach. If I was an Ironman person, I'm not sure the effort of raising the roof isn't worth it versus totally maximizing every aerobic piece of energy I could get to perform. I don't know the answer. I've worked with a couple of triathletes. It's not my area of specialty, but I got to tell you, just from seeing a lot of data, I'm not sure if that cost benefit would make sense to me to do the intensive work to raise the ceiling. Depends on the athlete, right? Depends on how capped out they are. And depends if what you're doing now is working, type of deal. But it certainly becomes, if I was an ultra rider and stuff like that, I would. Particularly if I was an ultra mountain biker and somebody involved in kind of harder, more extreme mixed events. I would do TAN and extended tempo. I have somebody testing it. I'm trying to test it. Part of the reason I am doing this workouts and what got Andy laughing was that's what I'm sort of testing. So I'm guinea pigging myself. I can tell you I just completed an event in West Virginia called the Diabolical Double, which some of you might know. And if you don't know about it, don't look it up, because you'll be tempted to do it. And trust me, don't. It's 125 miles and 17,000 feet of climbing. 17,000, yes, with 3 zeros, feet of climbing. It has 7 timed climbs, of which 6 of them average over 10%. So it's just brutal. And it was the second longest ride I've ever done. The longest ride I've ever done was the last time I did it, like 3 years ago, and swore I would never do it. And this time, it was somewhere in the 740 range, I think, was the time. It took a lot of work, a lot of watts, and I was poorly fueled and cracked at somewhere around 6.5 hours, still kind of dragging home pretty well. And it moved my stamina nicely, as you would think. So the reality is there is a benefit of long rides. It was like, that was the ultimate hell of being a guinea pig, excuse my French. That might have been my resignation letter for no longer being the test guinea pig, particularly for a guy who thrives on the track. It was certainly not my cup of tea, but we learned a lot about it. 2 things we learned, which I'm going to show you. It goes back to this, the other thing we learned, right? I didn't have a longer ride. So when I said the ability to stay on the power duration curve for overextended, what I mean by over is a time range you don't have. Like, look at this athlete, right? That's probably maybe 4 hours is their longest ride. So how do you predict a 6-7 hour ride? That's what we were doing. Because it was up to me, I'd ride my bike 20 minutes a day, guys, and I'd be done. I guess I'd laps around the track and go home and drink beer or something. So we were talking about how we can stay on the curve. Part of what stamina predicts is how well you'll stay on the curve past or beyond your longest ride, which is actually somewhat interesting to know for people getting into ultras and Ironman and other performances. So you don't replace in stamina the steady ride and long steady rides and fat burning rides, and understanding, go back to the point of fuel, you need to fuel for these. The fat burning side is important. So reality is the extensive side of what I was showing you in FTP, and go ride long. I mean, I wouldn't ride long every day. Again, it's cost, super careful with your cost benefit analysis here. It really depends what you're doing and how it works. But the reality is it's a combination of these two that drive stamina. So that completes the formal part of the webinar tonight. Hour and 10 minutes, man. I cannot make them shorter. I'm sorry, guys. I try. And let me see what questions. So, okay, I'm going to just read some of these out loud so you don't have to listen to sounds. Drop in your questions now. I'm going to see what I didn't get to. There is a lot. I think I got it. But, a lot of stuff you said tonight about the quality of intervals really hit home for me tonight. I always noticed that using the 95% of 20 minutes worked fine for intervals at or below FTP, but once I got over, I could never hit those workouts. My 90% of FTP has always gone up, but never done better than VO2 or AC work. At that point, I use wattage instead of percentage of FTP, which is smart, by the way. So my question is, what is the best way for me to determine training levels now? Eye levels. Yeah, Nick, you're the type of person, so I'm the reverse, right? I'm the exact reverse from you. So what Nick is saying is, because he doesn't fit on when he goes and does 20 minutes and he takes 95% of that, it's giving him a threshold number. But because he probably has a unique steady state ability, that he can hit those numbers when he's doing intervals level 4 and below, but he can't hit the numbers that threshold projects when he's doing levels, classic levels 5, 6, 7, new levels, all the ones above, right? And that's exactly why we created eye levels, because your individualization there, you're not fitting in the bell curve, so you need eye levels. I'm the reverse. If I use if I took my normalized power and used that as for an hour, or 95% of my, of a good 20 minutes, I can hit all the ones over level 4 easy. That's too easy for me. But I can't hit level 4 and level 3 or SST workouts at that level. So that's exactly what we created for it. So eye levels, yes, is a solution for you, and learn how to use them and adjust towards time. Should a tri guy, ultra guy, etc. give one flip about raising FRC? Jordan, I would give a flip, but go back to what I said about cost benefit, right? There's where I really think the cost probably wouldn't give you the benefit, but even if I go out here at 2 hours, right, I'm still getting 2 watts. So is the cost worth it for 2 watts? I mean, this person, by 5 hours, they're getting 1 watt, it's a steady decline. So you don't know. It kind of is an individual question to you. My general answer is I wouldn't care a lot about it at all. But where I would do it, I would do some work on it and I know I'm going to open up a whole dialogue here, but I would do some work on it in foundation and base building, where I would tackle it as a limiter, and I would do some work. Not enough to create a lot of fatigue, but I would tackle it then. Once I'm full on in training specificity, I'm not sure how much work I would do. Yeah, so Robert Smith puts in that he has a workout that is the workout itself is an NP buster. Yeah, Robert, that is the other thing. There, you can, if you know the algorithm of NP, build NP busting workouts. I mean, I can crush it. If I, one, I'm a natural NP buster, and then two, I understand the algorithm really well, so I can put the combination of the two together and drive normalized power nuts if I really want to. But that's exactly why now we have eye levels and tracking, and suddenly now you see us setting TTE and separating contribution and all kinds of unique stuff. You guys, I hope you see we're going somewhere. It'll be interesting to see if you guys, this is going to be a slow journey with WKO. It was slow when I know you had to wait. I have a feeling everybody's sensing the picking up of the steam, whether you're a runner and seeing all the new metrics that are coming out for running. You're seeing more and more insight, right? Training metrics. You're getting a better picture of yourself. You're individualizing. And then suddenly these metrics and this breakdown of anaerobic and aerobic energy and all these other stuff, I mean, I'll tell you right now, it's moving towards a more individualized scoring. There's a point, and I get the question at least once, or twice a week, well, if I'm using eye levels, shouldn't I be using some, different version of TSS? Yeah, we're getting there. It might not even be TSS. So, the people that are early engaged now are really in the early phases of an evolution, and maybe it doesn't stick. But, you're beginning to see this stuff create a pretty clear picture. What's funny is more and more people are answering their own question. That's what we're doing, because the picture's getting clearer. We're giving you deeper insight into the makeup of the human, of the individual, how the individual performs and how you can perform. I just noticed one other question I did not, I noticed two questions I didn't ask. No, one. Do you have a start time on stamina? I saw your picture is a 45-minute, 2 or 3 hour. Now, it really doesn't have a start time. Andy and I basically kind of say anytime after an hour, but I would really be concerned about it for events of, 3 to 4 hours or more, where I would really say, wow, that's a metric I want to pay attention to, so I was engaged in events that were that long and longer. So here is the other question. I knew I missed one other. What should be taken into consideration of prescribing FRC work, specifically the quantity? What should be the quantity of FRC intervals? Fitness, how fatigue resistant you are, how many you can withstand. You really, as a coach, want to quickly find your athlete's point of failure. And I hate saying failure. It's really a point of degradation, of decline. Once you know that, that's your starting point, and then it should be progressive, hopefully based on the amount of work and workload they're doing. So to me, Dave, watch the last webinar, I answer that question, and then watch the eye levels webinar where I show the power, and it's in your library, but watch the webinar and explain it, how to use the power duration curve to determine. This chart, Vanden, is super secret. It's not in the chart library. It's not for public consumption. If you guys email me directly, I don't want to put it in the Facebook group yet. If you email me directly at tim@WKO4, I will send it to you in the morning. I'm on the East Coast. It's getting kind of late, and it's been a long day. But I will answer all my emails in the morning. I'll send you this chart. I'll get to some of them tonight if there's not too many. But I will email it to you if you request it. Just drag and drop it over WKO4 and keep it secret. Cool. I think I got it. Any other questions I missed, you can email them to me. There's so many tonight. I think I intertwined them into all the answers. Appreciate everybody staying on so long. Right now we don't have any, we have one more from Frank Overton scheduled, webinars. We're going to slow down a little bit here in the summer just with everybody on vacation and stuff like that, but I should get the new series, the next couple coming up. If anybody has a request for webinars, put them in the Facebook group. Let's see what other people think. I love to tackle topics that people want to hear, so let us know if you have a topic. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.